On a late summer day, September 14th, 1955, a baby boy named Robert Francis Prevost was born in the city of Chicago, Illinois. He was the youngest of 3 brothers in a loving, close-knit family. His father, Louis, worked as a school principal and had French and Italian heritage, while his mother, Mildred, was a librarian with Spanish roots. The Prevost household was warm and modest, a 1-story brick home filled with the gentle bustle of family life. From the very beginning, faith and family went hand in hand. Robert's parents were devout Catholics who made church a central part of their lives, never missing Sunday Mass and staying active in their parish community. Surrounded by care and devotion, little Robert started life cradled in warmth, tradition, and hope. When Robert was still a toddler, the family moved to Dalton, a quiet suburb just south of Chicago's city limits. Dalton, in the late 1950s and 1960s, was a humble, hard-working American town. The streets were lined with cozy houses and shady trees, and neighbors all knew each other. Many fathers in the area worked long days at the nearby rail yards or steel mills, while mothers often volunteered at school or church. Children like Robert rode their bikes freely down the gentle streets. The scent of fresh-cut grass in the summer air and the distant sound of train whistles carrying on the breeze. It was the kind of upbringing often seen as the American dream. A safe neighborhood, friendly faces, and the simple joys of childhood each day. In this nurturing environment, Robert grew from a curious boy into a polite and thoughtful young teen, shaped by the values of family, faith, and community all around him. Robert's family belonged to St. Mary of the Assumption Parish, a Catholic church right at Chicago's southern edge, adjacent to Dalton. St. Mary of the Assumption Church in Chicago's Riverdale neighborhood near Dalton. In the 1960s, this parish church was the spiritual home of the Prevost family. Young Robert spent countless hours here, singing with the children's choir in the loft, breathing in the sweet smell of incense, and serving at the altar during Mass as an earnest altar boy. In its heyday, the church brimmed with worshippers on Sunday mornings, golden light dancing through stained glass windows as hymns echoed in the wooden pews. From an early age, Robert was drawn to the gentle rhythms of church life. He attended the parish's elementary school, St. Mary of the Assumption Parish School, where kind nuns and teachers guided him each day. There, he learned his ABCs and arithmetic in an atmosphere of kindness and patience. He also joined the children's choir, lifting his voice in song during Mass, and he served faithfully as an altar boy at St. Mary's, helping the priest during services. These experiences weren't just chores or activities to him. They were joyful duties. He loved the soft chiming of the church bells and the ritual of lighting candles on the altar. Each time young Robert put on his little black and white cassock and surplice to serve at the altar, he did so with quiet pride and reverence, feeling the importance of being part of something sacred. Even at play, Robert's imagination often reflected his deep faith. At home, he would sometimes play church with his brothers or friends, a gentle make-believe game that showed just how much he absorbed from Sundays at Mass. His older brother, John, remembered how little Bobby would carefully line up cookies or small round candies to serve as pretend communion hosts. The children would giggle as they took turns acting as the priest and the congregation. But behind the play was a real admiration for the rituals they saw each week. Neighbors later recalled how earnest and caring Robert was, even in these childhood games. One childhood friend even remembered playing a game of Red Rover on their quiet street and marveling that the boy she knew from those simple days would grow up to become someone so important. In those early years, Robert's world was small and safe, bounded by family, school, and church. and he embraced it with a full and happy heart. By the late 1960s, as Robert entered his teenage years, his path was already guided by a sense of calling. In 1969, at about 14 years old, he graduated from St. Mary's Parish School, having built a strong foundation in faith and knowledge. Those who knew him saw a bright boy with a gentle spirit and a keen mind. His good grades and thoughtful nature did not go unnoticed. Around this time, Robert felt a quiet tug in his heart, an interest in serving God more deeply, perhaps even as a priest one day. With the support of his devout family, he made a brave decision for such a young person. He would attend a special high school seminary to further explore this calling. So, in the fall of 1969, Robert bid farewell to his family home in Dalton and traveled to Holland, Michigan, to attend St. Augustine Seminary High School. This was an Augustinian boarding school, a small close-knit academy run by the Order of St. Augustine for boys considering the priesthood. It was a big change for Robert. He went from the familiar streets of his hometown to a serene campus in rural Michigan. The school itself was housed in a grand old estate known as the Felt Mansion, a stately brick building with large windows and historic charm, surrounded by tall trees and sand dunes near the lake. Here, the days were filled with both typical high school studies and moments of reflection and prayer. In the mornings, Robert and his classmates attended Mass in a modest chapel where sunlight would filter in, illuminating the dust motes in the air as they prayed. Afterwards, they went to classes in subjects like literature, history, math, and Latin. The afternoons might include choir practice. Yes, there was a choir here too, and Robert gladly lent his voice to it. Study periods in the old library, or maybe a game of baseball or touch football on the lawn when the weather was nice. Life at St. Augustine Seminary High School was disciplined but also full of camaraderie. With only a few dozen students in total, everyone knew everyone else by name. Robert was often called Bob by his friends, who found him to be a quietly cheerful and dependable companion. He worked hard in his studies, so hard, in fact, that he quickly excelled near the top of his class. He even picked up foreign languages with ease. By his second year, he could speak French fluently, which impressed teachers and classmates alike. But more than being smart, Robert was kind. If a classmate struggled with an assignment, Bob Prevost was the one eager to help. Friends later recalled that if you had trouble with your English essay or math homework, you could always go to Robert and he would patiently tutor you. In the evenings, after dinner in the dining hall, the boys would have quiet study time. One can imagine young Robert at a wooden desk by lamplight, dutifully finishing his homework, but also perhaps penning a letter home to his parents and brothers in Illinois, telling them about his day and assuring them he was doing well. Though he was far from home, the school community felt like a second family. They prayed together, studied together, and formed bonds that would last a lifetime. The 4 years of high school passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. By spring of 1973, Robert Prevost was 17 years old and ready to graduate from St. Augustine Seminary High School. During the graduation mass and ceremony, pride and bittersweet joy filled the air. Robert donned a black cap and gown like his fellow seniors, likely with a small pin of St. Augustine's emblem on it, and received his high school diploma with honors. His teachers and the Augustinian friars who ran the school gave him their blessing for the future. They knew Robert not only as a top student, recognized for his academic achievements and leadership in student activities, but also as a gracious young man with a compassionate heart. As he said goodbye to the quiet halls of the Felt Mansion and prepared to return to Chicago, Robert carried with him much more than textbooks and notes. He carried the lessons of discipline, friendship, and faith that had shaped him during those formative years. Leaving the seminary high school, Robert stood on the threshold of a new chapter. He had grown from a shy boy in Dalton into a confident yet humble young adult. The late spring breeze of 1973 was warm and filled with the scent of blooming flowers as he packed his bags and stepped forward, ready to continue his journey. His vocation, the sense of calling he felt, was stronger than ever. Ahead of him lay further studies and the first steps toward the priesthood. But for now, he took a moment to cherish all that had brought him to this point. The loving support of his family, the guidance of teachers and mentors, and his own unwavering faith. With a hopeful heart, Robert returned home for the summer, knowing that this was not an end but only the beginning of an extraordinary journey. He could not have imagined all the places that calling would lead him next. Before we jump into the next chapter, just a quick heads up. The visuals in this video add some extra context, but you don't need to watch them to enjoy the stories. So feel free to let this play in the background while you work, chill, or even drift off to sleep with the entire life of Robert Prevost. Also, if you'd like to help us keep making these videos and get access to exclusive content, plus enjoy everything ad-free, consider supporting us on Patreon. You'll find the link in the description and the comments section below. Alright, let's get back to the stories. 1973 to 1982, from Villanova to Vows. After 4 years in a quiet seminary high school tucked away in Michigan, Robert Prevost returned home to Illinois. In the fall of 1973, Robert packed again, this time for college. His destination, Villanova University, a Catholic college just outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The campus was grand and green, with ivy-covered stone buildings and sidewalks that wound like soft ribbons between classrooms and chapels. It was founded by the same religious order that had already helped shape Robert's life, the Order of St. Augustine. Villanova felt like home in a new place. There, Robert chose to study something few would guess for a future priest: mathematics. He loved the logic of it, the clean, certain patterns of numbers, the beauty in solving something step by step. While other students played loud music or stayed out late, Robert could often be found in the library, bent over a notebook, solving equations, or reading quiet books on faith and philosophy. He lived a life of gentle rhythm, morning classes, evening mass, silent walks beneath the tall trees, and always prayer, simple and steady, like the ticking of a trusted clock. At Villanova, Robert didn't just find knowledge, he found confirmation of something he'd been feeling for years, a deep pull toward God. In his final year, as the leaves turned gold and brown on the tree-lined campus, Robert knew it was time. So in 1977, not long after earning his degree in mathematics, he made a decision that few young men do. He entered the novitiate, the beginning of formal religious life, with the Order of St. Augustine. A novitiate year is quiet, reflective. It is spent in study, in silence, in self-examination. You live with others who are also discerning, learning not only the prayers and practices of the order, but how to live together, to share everything. No phones, no social media, just long walks, soft-spoken teachers, the rustle of robes in the hall, and the peaceful sound of the chapel bell each morning. Robert thrived in this life. He wasn't the loudest, but he was among the most devoted. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was with clarity and always with care. In 1981, after 4 years of study, service, and prayer, Robert took his solemn vows. These vows were more than words. they were promises. To live simply, to obey the will of God and the guidance of his religious superiors, and to remain celibate for the rest of his life, not out of obligation, but as a gift to serve the Church and its people fully. Then, in 1982, just shy of his 27th birthday, Robert was ordained as a priest in the Order of St. Augustine. It was a quiet ceremony, a special moment, with family in the pews, fellow brothers standing beside him, and the soft light of the sanctuary casting golden shadows on the stone floor. In that moment, hands were laid upon his head, ancient prayers were spoken, and Robert, the quiet boy from Dalton, became Father Prevost, a priest, a shepherd, a servant. But his journey was still only beginning. Ahead lay something unexpected, a calling not in Illinois or even in Pennsylvania, but in a country he had never been to, a land of high mountains, colorful markets, and warm people with stories of their own to share. 1985 to 1998, Mountains and Mission. When Father Robert Prevost was ordained a priest in 1982, he thought he might stay close to home, maybe in Chicago, maybe teaching or serving in a quiet parish. But the call he received was different. It came from far away, from a country of high peaks and deep valleys, of ancient temples and small villages, of families who spoke Spanish, and sometimes even older languages passed down through generations. The place was Peru, and when the Augustinian order asked Robert to go there, to teach, to serve, and to learn, he didn't hesitate. He packed only what he needed: books, a few clothes, his rosary, and the quiet courage of someone who trusted in God's plan. He arrived in Trujillo, a city on the coast, in 1985. The air was dry, filled with ocean breeze and desert dust. He had to learn quickly, not just how to speak Spanish, but how to speak with his heart to people whose lives were very different from his own. But Robert was a listener, always had been. He took time to walk the markets, to greet elders with a gentle nod, to kneel and pray with farmers, mothers, children. He wasn't just there to preach, he was there to learn. In Peru, he served in many roles. He was a missionary, yes, traveling long distances, sometimes on foot, to reach villages nestled in the mountains. He was also a pastor, offering mass in chapels where dogs sometimes wandered in during the service, and where candles flickered in glass jars beside simple wooden altars. He was a teacher, too, guiding young men who hoped to become priests themselves. The seminary where he taught was humble, with stone walls and wooden desks, and students who had grown up in farming towns, now dreaming of a future in the church. Robert poured his heart into his work. Every day he taught theology and scripture, but also respect, humility, and patience. His students said he made complicated ideas simple, that he listened deeply, that he treated each of them like they mattered, because to him they did. Outside of class, Robert visited families in their homes. He helped organize food and medicine for those in need. He sat with the sick. He blessed newborns. He buried the dead. And when a terrible earthquake struck in the 1990s, leaving hundreds of people without homes, Father Prevost helped lead the relief efforts, not with fanfare or big speeches, but by being present, by handing out blankets, by comforting those who had lost everything. In those 13 years, from 1985 to 1998, Peru became his second home. The language, the food, the music, he embraced it all. He ate warm bowls of ajita galina with his fellow friars, watched sunrises over the Andes, and celebrated Christmas with songs and fireworks under star-filled skies. He also became a citizen, not out of obligation, but out of love. Robert applied for Peruvian citizenship, and it was granted. Now, he wasn't just an American living abroad. He was truly a citizen of both worlds. The people called him Padre Roberto. They respected him, but more than that, they trusted him. Even bishops took notice. By the late 1990s, Robert's leadership was so clear, so steady and humble, that his Augustinian brothers elected him to something extraordinary. In 1998, he was called back to Rome, and just 3 years later, in 2001, he was elected to lead his entire order, the Order of St. Augustine, worldwide. But we'll get there in time. First, we'll pause here, in the peaceful mountain dusk of Peru, where a quiet priest from Chicago had become so much more than a visitor. He had become one of them. 2001 to 2013, a shepherd to the world. In the heart of Rome, not far from the ancient ruins and the quiet steps of pilgrims, there stands a building that few tourists ever see. It is simple, with arched windows and quiet courtyards, but inside, it holds the history of one of the oldest religious orders in the world. It is the headquarters of the Order of St. Augustine, and in the year 2001, the man chosen to lead it, to guide thousands of friars, priests, and brothers across the world, was a humble missionary from Peru, born in Chicago, named Robert Prevost. They called him Prior General, the highest role in the Augustinian order. It was not a job that came with fame, or power in the usual sense. There was no throne, no fine robes, only a deep responsibility to lead with wisdom, to listen with compassion, to serve with love. Robert had not asked for the role, but he accepted it, because that's what he always did. Each day, he walked the quiet halls of the Augustinian Curia in Rome, the mother house of the order. He rose early, prayed quietly, wrote letters, read reports, and then he traveled. So much travel: Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, North America. He visited friars in villages and cities, from crowded barrios in the Philippines to peaceful monasteries in Kenya, from the hills of Mexico to the mountains of Poland. Wherever he went, he listened. He sat with brothers in simple dining halls. He shared meals of rice, beans, or bread and tea. He asked questions. He heard stories. He offered encouragement. Sometimes he had to solve hard problems. Brothers who were in conflict, missions that lacked money, communities facing fear or persecution. He handled it all with the same calm grace he had shown back in Peru. But he wasn't just a traveler. Robert helped modernize the order. He supported education for young friars. He encouraged new missions in places where few priests had ever gone. He reminded everyone, from seasoned abbots to brand new novices, that God is found in service, not status. In Rome, he would sometimes walk at dusk through the quiet gardens behind the Curia. He liked the roses, the silence, the evening birdsong. Despite all the work, he never stopped being that boy from Dalton, gentle, steady, and faithful. And through it all, he stayed close to his roots. He still spoke with his brothers in Peru. He still answered letters from friends back home in Illinois. And when he could, he returned to Chicago for quiet visits with family. In 2007, Robert was elected to a second term as Prior General. Another 6 years of travel, decisions, and service. More stamps on his passport. More prayers whispered on long flights. More quiet unseen moments that slowly shaped the future of the Church in ways no camera would ever capture. When his term ended in 2013, he had served 12 years as the global head of his order, 12 years of helping others grow, 12 years of giving his all, without ever asking for anything in return. He left the role with quiet dignity, as he had accepted it with humility. But retirement was never part of his plan. God still had other places for him to go, and one of them would take him back to Peru, not as a teacher this time, but as something more. 2015 to 2023 called again. By 2013, after more than a decade in Rome, Robert Prevost might have expected a quieter path. He had already served as Prior General for 12 years, visiting dozens of countries, guiding thousands of brothers, and carrying the weight of a worldwide order with grace and care. But God, it seemed, was not done with him yet. In the years following his return from Rome, Robert spent time back in Peru, the country he still called home in his heart. The sun still rose over the Andes. The people still greeted him with warmth and respect. Buenos dias, Padre Roberto. He had been a missionary, a pastor, a teacher, and a leader. Now, in 2015, he was asked to take on something even greater, a responsibility that only a few are ever called to accept. That year, Pope Francis appointed him Bishop of Chiclayo, a coastal diocese in northern Peru. Chiclayo was a city of contrast, bustling markets, narrow streets, old churches with fading paint, wide smiles and deep poverty. The diocese stretched far beyond the city, across farms, fishing towns, dusty hills and jungle edges. Hundreds of thousands of people, many with deep faith, but limited resources. Robert said yes, because he always said yes. On the day of his ordination as bishop, the cathedral was filled with people. Villagers traveled hours by bus. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. There was music, not grand organ music from Europe, but lively drums and joyful songs sung in Spanish. And in the center of it all stood Robert Prevost, now wearing the simple gold ring of a bishop and carrying a shepherd's staff, not as a symbol of power, but of service. As bishop, Robert led with quiet strength. He listened to priests from tiny parishes. He met with families in their homes. He stood in soup kitchens, blessed babies, and walked through flood zones after heavy rains washed away homes. He never saw himself as above anyone. When asked how he viewed his role, he once said, "The bishop is not a manager. He is a father. He is a brother. He is a pastor." And he lived that truth every single day. But even in Peru, Rome was watching. Pope Francis, himself a former missionary, saw something special in Bishop Prevost. His fluency in Spanish, his calm demeanor, his experience in Latin America, and his lifetime of quiet, faithful service. Always humble, always consistent. So, in 2023, the Pope called him again, this time to take on one of the most powerful roles in the Vatican. Robert Prevost was appointed prefect of the dicastery for bishops, a long title that meant he would now help choose bishops for dioceses around the world. It was a role once held by cardinals. Now it would be held by him. And not only that, he was also made president of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America. A man who had once taught math in a dusty Peruvian classroom was now guiding the future leadership of the entire Catholic Church. Later that same year, in September of 2023, Pope Francis made it official. He named Robert Francis Prevost a cardinal at St. Peter's Basilica, Beneath the vast dome and golden light, Robert knelt before the Pope. He was given a red biretta, the traditional square cap worn by cardinals, and a ring, a symbol of his new rank. But even in that moment of great ceremony, Robert remained. Robert, quiet, grateful, neither seeking attention nor shrinking from the task. He now wore the red, the color of sacrifice, of service, and of courage. But he was still the same boy from Dalton, still the same missionary from Chiclayo, still the same teacher, brother, and priest. As 2023 came to a close, no one could know what lay ahead. No one could guess that in just 2 years, this quiet cardinal would be chosen for a role unlike any other in the world. 2025, the conclave and the call. It began, as these things always do, with silence. On April 21st, 2025, the world received solemn news. Pope Francis had passed away, peacefully, quietly, at the age of 88. The Vatican bells tolled. Crowds gathered in St. Peter's Square. Candles flickered in windows across the globe. And the church, vast, ancient, deeply rooted, began its sacred ritual of choosing a new shepherd. For the 266th time in history, a papal conclave was called, a secret meeting of the cardinals, men from every continent, some young, some old, all dressed in red, all carrying the weight of centuries, and among them, walking without fanfare, shoulders just slightly bowed, was Cardinal Robert Prevost. Some said it was his calm that drew them. Others said it was his blend of pastoral wisdom and global experience, a bridge between North and South America, between tradition and change. On May 8, 2025, after the 5th round of voting, the white smoke rose, soft, billowing, pure, a signal to the world. Habemus Papam, we have a pope. The crowds surged in the square, cameras rolled. Eyes turned to the famous balcony above the basilica doors. And when the curtain was drawn back, a familiar, gentle figure stepped forward. The voice of the senior cardinal rang out across the square. I announce to you with great joy, we have a pope. His name is Robertus Franciscus Prevost, and he has taken the name Leo XIV. The square fell still, and then applause, tears, smiles. The faithful rejoiced. An American, a missionary, a scholar, a man of two continents, now Pope. When Robert stepped forward to speak, his voice was quiet, clear, deliberate. He began his inaugural address by thanking Pope Francis, calling him a father to the poor and the forgotten, a bridge builder, a light in a dark time. Then, with his eyes lifting gently across the crowd, he said, I am a servant. I am a son of the Americas, raised in the north, formed in the south, and guided always by the mercy of Christ. Together, we will walk a path of peace, of justice, and of unity. And with that, the world met Pope Leo XIV. His choice of name surprised some, but those who knew history understood. Pope Leo XIII, a century before, had been a champion of social justice. He wrote about workers' rights, about fairness, about the dignity of every human being. By choosing the name Leo, Robert was pointing to that same mission. He wasn't there to rule. He was there to guide, to heal, to listen. Across the United States, church bells rang. For the first time in history, an American-born pope had been chosen. And not just American, he was also Peruvian, a citizen of two nations, a bridge between hemispheres, and even more uniquely, he was the first pope from the order of St. Augustine, a quiet, ancient order that had shaped his life from the very beginning. Back in Dalton, Illinois, the small town where he'd grown up, neighbors wept in front yards. His childhood church, St. Mary of the Assumption, held a special mass of celebration. Old friends remembered Bobby Prevost, the altar boy, the math student, the gentle voice in the choir, and now the Holy Father. And in Chiclayo, Peru, in the dusty streets where he had once walked, crowds gathered with candles, singing songs of joy under a starlit sky. To them, he wasn't just a pope. He was one of them, their Padre Roberto, now Pope Leo. The road that led him here had been long. From Dalton to Villanova, from the Andes to Rome, from classrooms and mission fields, to the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. But the man had never changed, quiet, faithful, humble, and now entrusted with the care of 1.4 billion Catholics. 5 factors we believe propelled Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost past more favored contenders. 1. Vast global experience. Missionary foundations in Peru. Prevost spent over 2 decades, 1980s, 2000s, serving in rural Peru as a member of the Augustinian order. There he learned Spanish, immersed himself in local cultures, and earned a reputation for hands-on pastoral care among poor and indigenous communities. Head of the dicastery for bishops. Back in Rome, he led the office that evaluates and recommends episcopal appointments around the world. That role put him in close dialogue with hundreds of bishops and cardinals, especially from Latin America and Africa, building goodwill that translated into votes. Multilingual fluency, fluent in English, Spanish, Italian, and competent in Portuguese. Prevost could address cardinals in their own languages, reinforcing personal rapport in a conclave hall where English was the lingua franca among a highly diverse college. 2. Reputation as a consensus builder. Humble leadership style. Peers describe him as unpretentious and down-to-earth, someone who listens more than he lectures. That humility bridged the gap between conservative cardinals, wary of Pope Francis's reforms, and progressives, pushing for more changes. Track record of collaboration. As dicastery prefect, Prevost convened working groups on governance and finance, routinely seeking wide input before making recommendations, a sharp contrast to more top-down administrators. Personal warmth and charisma. Observers noted small but telling gestures, inviting cardinals to informal chats over coffee, remembering details about their diocese. That built trust across factions in the lead-up to the conclave. 3. Conviction in sin. In his pivotal pre-conclave address, Prevost argued that the Church must move from governance by decree to governance by dialogue. This call for synodality, ruling through widespread consultation, resonated with those who saw it as the best path to implement and deepen Francis's reforms. He outlined plans for continental synods to address regional issues, for example, poverty in Africa, secularization in Europe, signaling he'd back structural changes, not just rhetoric. By framing synodality as a continuation rather than a departure from his predecessor's style, Prevost united cardinals who valued both stability and renewal. 4. Shrewd bloc Laval voting dynamics. Cardinal Pietro Parolin lead early polls, but those uneasy about his more conservative reputation quietly agreed to withhold votes from him. Prevost emerged as the compromise none of the main blocs could veto. After 2 ballots showed a split between Parolin and Luis Antonio Tegel's supporters, a third-round swing toward Prevost created the impression of a rising tide, prompting further shifts as cardinals sought to back a winner. By ballot 4, Enough parrying among blocks gave Prevost the 89 votes needed, 2/3 of 133, to trigger white smoke. A textbook example of strategic compromise in conclave politics. 5. Influence of Cardinal Dolan. In accordance with the New York Post, reports suggest that Cardinal Timothy Dolan, Archbishop of New York, played a pivotal role in garnering support for Prevost's election, highlighting the collaborative dynamics within the conclave. He is reported to have skillfully navigated conversations among fellow cardinals, emphasizing Prevost's pastoral strengths, global experience, and ability to unify different factions within the Church. His support helped consolidate a significant voting bloc early in the conclave, speeding up Prevost's election process. This demonstrates how conclave dynamics are not solely about ideology, but also about strategic alliances and trust among Church leaders. How will political views of Robert Prevost shape his papacy? Pope Leo XIV has signaled that his papacy will continue to champion the causes of the marginalized, migrants, the poor, and those suffering economic inequality. By emphasizing solidarity and social justice, he's also voiced strong support for environmental stewardship and human rights, seeing care for creation as inseparable from the Church's mission. Internally, he favors synodality, a more consultative, grassroots approach to decision-making, while upholding traditional doctrines on ordination. Though he stopped short of ordaining women as priests or deacons, he has expressed openness to increasing women's roles in other leadership and advisory bodies. Building on these commitments, Leo XIV's tenure is likely to blend continuity with a fresh perspective shaped by his American background. He's expected to maintain a firm ethical stance on liturgical and doctrinal matters, even as he pushes further on social justice initiatives, especially around migration and poverty. At the same time, he views the rise of artificial intelligence and robotics as a new industrial revolution demanding moral guidance. So don't be surprised if he launches Vatican-wide efforts to address technology's ethical implications. Please let us know what you learned from the life of Robert Prevost, and share with us the country you're watching it from and what time it is when you're watching this video in the comments section below. And it would mean the world to us if you could like, subscribe, and share this video to your loved ones. Thank you everyone for watching. Sleep tight.